The year was 1887. The humid air of Alabama hung heavy and thick, a palpable presence that clung to the skin like a shroud. For Thomas, it was the air of dread, a feeling that had settled deep in his bones the moment he stepped off the dusty coach in Montgomery. He was a young journalist, a man who had traded the bustling, modern streets of New York for the slow, oppressive rhythm of the South. His purpose was simple, yet burdened with a history he was only beginning to understand: to document the closure of a chapter in American history, to interview the last living members of the plantation era. Specifically, he was there to visit the infamous Blackwood family. The Blackwood estate was a sprawling, melancholic ruin of what was once a grand plantation. The once pristine white columns were now stained with the grime of time, and the manicured gardens were a wild tangle of overgrown weeds. A sense of decay permeated every corner, a silent testament to a forgotten time. Thomas was met at the front door by Elias Blackwood, a man who seemed to have aged 100 years in a few decades. His face was a map of deep-set wrinkles, and his eyes held a haunted, distant look. He welcomed Thomas with a somber nod, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "You're here for the story, I presume," Elias said, leading him into the dimly lit foyer. The house was a museum of shadows. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that managed to pierce the heavy velvet curtains. The air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood, forgotten memories, and something else. Something metallic and earthy that Thomas couldn't quite place. Elias's wife, Margaret, appeared from the shadows, her presence as ethereal as a ghost. She was thin and pale, her eyes wide and filled with a profound sorrow. She carried a candelabra, casting long, dancing shadows across their faces. "Legacy is a heavy burden, young man," she said, her voice a brittle whisper. "Some legacies are best left buried." Thomas's curiosity, however, was a stubborn force. He had heard whispers and rumors in town about the Blackwoods, tales of a sudden, drastic decline in their fortunes after the war, a strange secrecy surrounding a locked room in the servants' quarters, and an unsettling silence from the formerly bustling family. They were a family that had simply withdrawn from the world, and no one dared to pry too deeply. Over the next few days, Thomas began his interviews. He spoke with Elias and Margaret in the grand, yet decaying drawing room. Their answers were evasive, filled with long pauses and sideways glances. They spoke of the good old days with a wistful, almost desperate tone, yet they grew tense and withdrawn whenever the subject of the post-war years was brought up. The plantation's decline was a subject they skirted around, attributing it to bad harvests and the changing times. But Thomas was a journalist, trained to read between the lines. He noticed the way their hands trembled when they spoke of the past. He saw the way Margaret would often stare at the wall, her eyes fixated on a spot seemingly in the middle of nowhere, as if seeing something he couldn't. He also noticed something else, a constant, low humming sound that seemed to emanate from the back of the house, a sound they pretended not to hear. One evening, as a storm brewed outside, Thomas was left alone in the drawing room while Elias went to fetch a book. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant thunder and the rhythmic creak of the house settling on its foundations. His gaze fell upon an old, leather-bound journal on a side table. It was open, and Thomas couldn't resist. He saw a page filled with a frantic, looping script. He read a single, chilling entry. "The weight of silence is heavier than any chain. We are all prisoners now. The room demands its due." Just then, Elias returned, his eyes narrowing as he saw Thomas near the journal. He snatched it up, his movement surprisingly quick for a man of his age. "This is private," he said, his voice hard. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by a cold, protective hostility. "I apologize," Thomas said, his heart pounding. He had crossed a line, and the air had grown even colder. Later that night, unable to sleep, Thomas was drawn by the low hum he had been hearing. He crept out of his room, his boots silent on the wooden floor. The sound was coming from the back of the house, near what he knew were the servants' quarters. The hum was now more distinct, a low, continuous vibration that felt more mechanical than human. He reached the end of a long, dark corridor. The last door was different from the others. It was sealed with heavy iron chains and a thick wooden plank nailed across it. The wood was old, but the metal of the chains looked disturbingly new, as if they had been put there recently. The hum was loudest here, a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards. He pressed his ear against the cold wood. He couldn't hear anything from within, just the hum. He reached out to touch the chains, his fingers tracing the cold metal. As he did, he heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound from behind the door. It wasn't a voice, not a moan or a whisper. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping. He recoiled, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tapping was persistent, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a message being sent. Thomas's mind raced. What was in this room? Why was it sealed? And who or what was inside? The rumors of the sealed room with slaves inside flashed into his mind, and the phrase from the journal echoed in his ears. The room demands its due. The questions swirled in his mind, but one thought solidified with chilling clarity. The Blackwoods were not just hiding a secret. They were living with a haunting, and it was a haunting born not of spirits, but of a very real, very human horror. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving a silence so profound that Thomas's own ragged breathing felt like a roar in the darkness. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his hand still hovering near the cold chains. The image of the sealed door burned into his mind. He knew he couldn't stay. The risk of being discovered was too great, and the fear he felt was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing his gut. He retreated to his room, his mind reeling. The hum was fainter from here, but he could still feel the low vibration in the floor. Sleep was impossible. He spent the night staring at the ceiling, piecing together the fragments of what he had observed. The Blackwood's guilt was a tangible presence, a toxic fog that filled every room. The evasive answers, the haunted eyes, the journal entry, it all pointed to a terrible secret. The rumors of the sealed room now felt less like folklore and more like a terrifying reality. But what was the hum? It was too constant, too mechanical to be a person. It was a machine. But what kind of machine would be locked away in a room with people? The next morning, the atmosphere at breakfast was tense. Elias and Margaret were even more withdrawn than usual, their faces pale and their movements slow. They didn't mention the journal, and Thomas didn't dare bring it up. The silence was punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and the low, persistent hum from the back of the house. Thomas decided to change his strategy. He couldn't force them to talk about the sealed room directly. He had to approach the secret from another angle. He began asking about the plantation's operation before the war. He learned about the cotton fields, the bustling workforce, and the old mill. Elias spoke of the mill with a particular fondness, detailing its innovative machinery and its efficiency. It was powered by a complex water system and a new type of generator that had been imported from Europe. This detail sparked something in Thomas's mind. A generator. Could that be the source of the humming? He spent the rest of the day in the library, a musty room filled with forgotten books. He was looking for any documents related to the plantation's operations. He found ledgers, old letters, and a series of blueprints for the main house and the surrounding buildings. The blueprints for the servants' quarters were particularly interesting. He found the schematic for the back wing, and there it was, the very last room. It was labeled simply, "Storage Room." But there was a note scrawled in the margin, in a different, frantic hand. "Do not open, do not disturb. The air is poisoned." The handwriting was the same as the journal entry. It was Elias's. Thomas felt a jolt of fear. Poisoned air. What did that mean? He looked at the blueprint again, and this time he noticed a very small detail in the corner of the room. A tiny pipe leading from an unspecified location to the sealed room. A pipe that looked like it was meant to carry something. Gas? Water? He decided to explore the grounds. Elias and Margaret were preoccupied with their own silent rituals of grief and worry, so he was left to his own devices. He walked through the overgrown gardens, his boots crunching on dry leaves. He found the old mill, its massive water wheel still and rusted. The generator that Elias had mentioned was a huge contraption of iron and brass, covered in dust and cobwebs. It looked inactive, so if the hum was from a generator, it couldn't be this one. The humming was constant, and this machine was clearly out of commission. He walked past the mill and found the old slave cabins, small wooden shacks now in various states of disrepair. A wave of sadness washed over him. He imagined the lives that had been lived here, the families that had been torn apart, the suffering that had stained this land. He saw a small, elderly woman sitting on the porch of one of the cabins. She was a former servant, he presumed. Her name was Clara. He had seen her before, but she had always seemed to avoid him. Thomas approached her slowly, respectfully. "Excuse me, Ma'am," he said. "I'm Thomas. I'm a journalist here to learn about the history of the plantation." Clara looked at him, her eyes clouded with age, but with a surprising spark of intelligence. "History is a thing you feel, not a thing you read," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "This place, it breathes its history. I've heard rumors," Thomas said carefully, "about a sealed room in the back of the house." Clara's face hardened. She looked away, her gaze distant. "Some things are best not talked about, young man. Some truths. They ain't for a man like you to know." Thomas persisted, his voice low and earnest. "I heard a sound, a humming and a tapping. Are there people in there?" Clara didn't answer for a long time. She just stared out at the overgrown fields. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "There were, before the war, a handful of families, Blackwoods. They were peculiar." She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. "They had a new idea, a way to protect their property. They said it was for their safety, for our safety. A place to keep us safe from the Union soldiers, they said. A bunker." "A bunker?" Thomas asked, a cold dread washing over him. "A sealed room, with a machine. They told us it was for fresh air, for ventilation, a new invention. But we knew it was for something else, something evil." She shook her head, tears now streaming down her weathered cheeks. "They sealed it right before the Yankees came. Elias's father, the old master, he locked them in. He said they'd be safe. But the war ended. The Yankees came and went, and the door, it never opened." Thomas's blood ran cold. He had assumed they were sealed after the war, a dark secret to hide. But before, why? Did anyone try to get them out? He asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," Clara said, her voice filled with a bitter sorrow. "They tried, but the master had a key, and he never opened it. And then the machine, it started to hum, and then it stopped." She looked at Thomas, her gaze filled with a profound and ancient sorrow. "For a long time, we heard nothing. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, you can hear the screams of the dead. It ain't a hum, young man. It's a whisper, the whispering walls. They tell a story only the dead can hear." Thomas realized the horrifying truth. The tapping he heard wasn't coming from inside. It was an echo of a sound that had been silenced for over 2 decades. It was the house itself, a living tomb, whispering its terrible secrets. The revelation from Clara left Thomas in a state of shock. The puzzle pieces he had been trying to fit together now formed a terrifying picture. The humming wasn't a recent sound. It was an echo of the past, a persistent phantom in the house's cold heart. The tapping he heard wasn't a living person, but a sound that had been preserved, trapped within the walls. A final, desperate message from those who had been left to die. The Blackwoods weren't just hiding a secret. They were living inside a monument to their own monstrous act. He returned to the house, the humid air feeling even heavier than before. He looked at Elias and Margaret with new eyes. They were not just haunted by a secret, they were living with the ghosts of their actions, their faces a reflection of the guilt that had festered for 22 years. Their quiet despair, their distant gazes, it all made a terrible, tragic sense. They were living in a tomb of their own making. That night, Thomas made a plan. He needed to see the room for himself. He needed to get inside. The chains, the plank, they were a desperate attempt to contain a past that refused to be silenced. He couldn't just write about it, he had to prove it. He waited until the house was asleep. The only sounds, the creak of old wood and the rhythmic thrum of the cicadas outside. He gathered his tools, a crowbar he had found in the mill, a small lantern, and a piece of cloth to muffle any sound. He crept down the long, dark corridor to the sealed door. The humming was faint, but it was there, a low vibration that seemed to come from the very floor beneath his feet. He could feel the cold, oppressive energy radiating from the door. He tried the crowbar on the plank first. The wood was old and brittle, but the nails were thick and firmly embedded. He worked slowly, deliberately, trying to make as little noise as possible. The wood groaned under the pressure, a low, tortured sound that echoed in the silence. He paused, listening. No footsteps, no lights. Elias and Margaret were either in a deep sleep or chose to ignore the sounds. After what felt like an hour, the plank finally splintered and fell to the floor with a soft thud. He winced, but no one came. He then turned his attention to the chains. They were a more difficult obstacle. The links were thick, and the lock was old and rusted. He knew he couldn't break it. He had to find a key. He remembered Elias's words from the night before, a chilling echo in his mind. "This is private." Elias had snatched the journal away as if it contained the key to a vault. Perhaps it did. Thomas crept back to the drawing room, the lantern casting a small circle of light around him. He found the journal on the same side table. This time, he didn't just read. He searched. He went through the pages, a frantic search for any mention of a key, a combination, a hidden location. He found entries filled with Elias's despair, his regret, his guilt. He found mentions of a key. Elias's father had a key to the room, a key he had hidden somewhere in the house. A single ominous entry read, "The key is in the place where the silence screams." Thomas's blood ran cold. The silence screamed in the sealed room. The key was there, inside. It was a macabre, grotesque irony. The key to the cage was inside the cage itself. He returned to the corridor. He knew he couldn't open the door. The chains were too strong. He had to find another way in. He remembered the blueprints, the tiny pipe leading into the room. He followed the pipe's path on the schematic, his finger tracing a line from the room to a small crawl space under the house. The crawl space was accessible from the outside. He put the crowbar back and extinguished the lantern, the darkness swallowing him whole. He made his way to the back of the house, his feet sinking into the muddy ground. The storm from the night before had left the earth soft and wet. He found the small wooden grate that covered the crawlspace entrance. It was old and rotted. A single pull and it came loose. The crawlspace was a dark, confined space, filled with spiders, dust, and the smell of damp earth. He crawled on his hands and knees, the dirt staining his clothes. The air was thick and oppressive, and he could feel the cold hum of the house's foundation. He followed the pipe, his hand tracing its length in the dark. The pipe was old and corroded, but it was still intact. It led him to a small wooden panel in the crawlspace wall. The panel was old, a different kind of wood from the rest of the foundation. It was an access point. He used his knife to pry it open. It was stiff, but it gave way. Inside, he found a small, narrow space. It wasn't a crawl space anymore. It was an air duct, a very old, very large air duct. The hum was deafening here, a constant, low roar. He felt the vibration in his teeth. This was the source of the hum. This was the ventilation system Elias's father had built, the machine Clara had spoken of. It was still running. A low, persistent machine, pumping. What? He crawled into the air duct. The space was tight, claustrophobic. The air was stale, and he could smell the same earthy, metallic scent he had noticed in the foyer. He crawled forward, the hum growing louder with every inch. The duct led him directly to the sealed room. He saw a small grate in the wall, just big enough for a man to squeeze through. It was the last part of the system. He was inside the room. He pushed the grate open and slid through. He landed on a pile of something soft and dusty. He lit his lantern, and the flickering light revealed the interior of the room. It wasn't a bunker. It was a cellar. A large, stone-walled cellar filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. But the furniture wasn't the focal point. The focal point was the other side of the room. He saw the source of the humming. A massive iron generator connected to a complex series of pipes and valves. It was a ventilation system, but not for fresh air. The pipes didn't lead outside. They led to a series of large iron cylinders lined up against the far wall. The cylinders were old and rusted, and a few of them had a sticky, viscous fluid leaking from the seams. The fluid was a dark, metallic brown. The air in the room was thick with the smell of iron and decay. And then he saw it, the source of the tapping. It wasn't a person. It was a small metal box on the floor, next to a large, empty iron cylinder. The box was connected to a series of wires and a small battery-powered device. The device was a metronome. It was tapping, a slow, deliberate rhythm, a ghost of a sound from a time long past. The sound he had heard was not an echo. It was a machine that was still working after all these years, a chilling reminder of what had happened in this room. He saw a small, ornate key on the floor next to the box, the key to the chains. He picked it up, his hands shaking. He looked at the cylinders, at the dripping fluid, at the pipes connected to the generator. He realized the horrifying truth. The Blackwoods didn't just lock people in. They used the ventilation system not to give them air, but to pump something else into the room. The metallic, earthy smell, the rusted cylinders, the fluid. It wasn't a bunker. It was a gas chamber. And the humming was the sound of the pump, a low, persistent death song. The silence that screamed was the silence of those who had been suffocated. Thomas's discovery was a punch to the gut. The truth was far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. The Blackwoods hadn't merely sealed people away, they had executed them, methodically and cruelly, using a monstrous machine. The generator wasn't for ventilation, it was a pump. The pipes didn't carry air, they carried a poison. The metronome wasn't a ghost. It was a grotesque timer, a chilling testament to the cold, calculated nature of the crime. The key to the chains was right there, a final, sadistic taunt. He stood in the center of the room, his lantern light dancing on the dust motes and the rusting metal. The stench of iron and decay was overwhelming. The weight of the room's history was a physical force, a heavy blanket of sorrow and death. He realized the full extent of the Blackwoods' depravity. They hadn't just committed a crime. They had built a machine to do it for them, a monstrous contraption hidden in plain sight, a silent, humming testament to their cruelty. He knew he couldn't just leave. He had to find evidence. He had to understand the why. Why this method? Why this room? He began to search. He moved the sheets off of the old furniture, revealing a desk, a couple of chairs, and an old wooden trunk. He opened the trunk. Inside, he found a collection of ledgers. They were not for the plantation's accounts. They were a log of the sealed room. He opened the first one. The handwriting was neat and precise, a stark contrast to the horrific entries he found within. The log was a horrifying record of the days leading up to the war's end. It listed the names of the enslaved families who were locked in the room, their names, their ages, their families. He saw the names: Samuel, a carpenter, his wife, Ilara, their 3 children; John, a field hand, his wife, Mary, their baby, born just 2 weeks before the sealing. Page after page, a list of human beings reduced to entries in a ledger of death. The entries for the days after the sealing were even more chilling. He read about the generator being activated, the duration of its use, and the calculated amount of gas used. The entries were cold, clinical, and devoid of any humanity. It was the work of a man who saw other people not as human beings, but as a problem to be solved, a resource to be eliminated. Elias's father was the author. The man was a monster. He found one final entry, a single looping scrawl that was out of place in the precise ledger. The weight of the silence is heavier than any chain. We are all prisoners now. The room demands its due. He recognized the handwriting. It was Elias's. He had added his own note to his father's ledger, a confession of guilt. The room demanded its due. The silence of the dead was a debt that the living had to pay. He had his story. He had the proof. The ledgers were all he needed. He gathered them, his hands shaking, and put them in his bag. He had to get out of the house. He had to expose this. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound from the other side of the room. A slow, scraping sound, followed by a soft thud. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound came from behind the last iron cylinder. He held his lantern up, his hand trembling. He slowly moved toward the sound. The scrape happened again, closer this time. He saw a small, dark shape move from behind the cylinder. It was a rat, a large one, dragging a piece of wood. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He was so on edge, the slightest noise was enough to make him jump. But as the rat scurried away, he noticed something in its place. A small wooden box. It was a lockbox, old and covered in a thick layer of dust. He knelt down and brushed the dust away. The box was sealed with a small padlock. He had no key. He shook the box, but he heard nothing. He knew he had to open it. It was the last piece of the puzzle. He took a small metal file from his bag and worked at the padlock. It was old and brittle, and after a few minutes of careful filing, it snapped open. He opened the lid. Inside, he found a single object, a pocket watch. It was a beautiful old watch with intricate carvings on its face. He opened it, and a small inscription was carved on the inside of the case. It read, "To my dearest Elias, on the day of his birth, for the time we do not have." The watch was a gift from Elias's father to his son. It was a chilling memento. He also found a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a letter, written in the same frantic, looping scrawl as the journal entries. It was from Elias to his father. It was dated a week before the sealing. The letter detailed Elias's plea to his father to not go through with his plan. Elias wrote about the moral horror of what he was about to do, the injustice, the inhumanity. He pleaded with his father to let the enslaved families go, to let them have their freedom. But the letter was a plea, not a threat. It was the letter of a man who was horrified by his father's actions, but powerless to stop him. Thomas realized that Elias was not a willing participant. He was a prisoner of his father's monstrous legacy. The guilt he carried was not just for the actions of his family, but for his own inaction, his own inability to save the people in that room. The hum wasn't just a machine. It was the sound of his own conscience, a persistent reminder of his failure. He had the proof. He had the ledgers. He had the motive. He had the full, unvarnished truth. The Blackwoods were not a family of monsters. They were a family with a monster at its head, and a son who was broken by his own complicity. He now had the full story, a story of human depravity and the crushing weight of a past that refused to stay buried. He had to get out of the house and tell this story to the world. He had to let the silence finally scream. The letter from Elias solidified Thomas's understanding of the man's profound despair. It was not the guilt of a perpetrator, but the crushing burden of a witness. Elias was a silent accomplice, a prisoner of his father's twisted will. His sorrow wasn't for his lost wealth or prestige, it was for the lives he failed to save. This changed everything. Thomas no longer saw a family of cruel monsters, but a man and woman broken by a secret they were forced to keep. He carefully put the letter and the watch back in the lockbox, and the ledgers into his bag. He had the proof he needed. He had to get out, and he had to do it now, before Elias or Margaret discovered him. He slid back through the air duct, the hum of the generator a constant, maddening presence in his ears. He crawled back through the dusty crawlspace and emerged into the night air. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows. The house looked like a dark spectre, a silent monument to a horror buried deep within its foundations. He crept back to his room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to act quickly. He had to leave before dawn. He packed his bag, the weight of the ledgers a heavy physical reminder of the truth he now held. He scribbled a note, a simple message to Elias and Margaret. I know what happened. I have the proof. I will tell the story. Let the silence scream. He left the note on his pillow, a final defiant act of a man who had seen too much. As he tiptoed down the stairs, he heard a sound from the drawing room, a soft, muffled sob. He stopped, his hand on the banister. He saw Margaret, sitting in a chair, her face buried in her hands. Elias was standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his own face a mask of profound sorrow. The low hum of the generator filled the silent house, a constant reminder of their shared torment. He saw the full tragedy of their lives, a life of silent suffering, of guilt and regret. He wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort. But what could he say? He had seen the proof of their family's monstrous act, a crime he was about to expose to the world. He was the one who was about to let the silence scream. He was the one who would set them free, but at the cost of their remaining reputation and peace. He turned and walked to the front door, his hand on the knob. The door was locked. He tried the back door. It was locked as well. The windows were all barred. He was trapped. A cold dread washed over him. He heard footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate. He turned. Elias stood there, a ghostly figure in the dim light of the foyer. He held an old, single-barrel shotgun in his hands. His eyes were wide and filled with a desperate, frantic fear. "I know what you did, Mr. Blackwood," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I was in the room. I have the ledgers." Elias shook his head, a single bitter tear rolling down his wrinkled cheek. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice a broken, hollow echo. "He didn't just lock them in. He locked us in too." Thomas didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" "The generator," Elias said, his voice barely audible. "It's a machine, yes, but it's not just a pump. It's a filtration system. My father, he believed in a theory about the air. He said the air was filled with a certain element, a poison. He said it was everywhere, and it was the source of all evil. He called it the miasma." Thomas's mind raced. Miasma, a Victorian-era theory about disease. He had read about it in medical journals. It was a debunked theory, but it was still a popular belief among some. "He said he had a machine to filter it," Elias continued, his voice thick with a profound, bitter shame. "He said the room was a sanctuary, a place where people could be free of the miasma. He was going to save them. He had a theory that if the air was pure, people would become Better. More human. He was a scientist in his own mind. A mad scientist. He was a murderer, Thomas said, his voice filled with a cold, righteous anger. Yes, Elias said, a single sob escaping his lips. He was. But it was not for the reasons you think. He didn't lock them in to kill them. He locked them in to save them. He believed the poison in the air would kill them slowly. He had another theory. A theory about a cure. He lowered the shotgun, his hands trembling. He was a monster, he said, his voice cracking. He was going to purify them. He was going to filter the miasma from them. He thought he was going to create a new kind of human being. He called it the Black Wood, the Black Heart. He gestured at the house, a dark, ghostly shadow. This entire house, it was his laboratory. The truth was a cold, cruel thing. The Blackwoods weren't just a family of perpetrators. They were a family of victims. Elias was the victim of his father's madness. He was locked in a life of silent suffering, a prisoner of a legacy he never chose. He was a witness to a crime he couldn't prevent, and a keeper of a secret he couldn't escape. The hum wasn't just a machine. It was a silent witness to a crime, a constant reminder of a family's descent into madness and a son's profound failure. Thomas looked at the shotgun in Elias's hands. He saw not a threat, but a man on the brink of despair. He saw a man who had been living a life of silent screams for over 20 years. He saw a man who was ready to end it all. The full scope of Elias's father's madness was a horrifying revelation. It wasn't a simple act of cruelty, but a meticulously planned, pseudo-scientific experiment of a madman. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a self-proclaimed god, attempting to purify humanity and create a new race free from the world's poisons. The plantation wasn't a home, it was a laboratory. The enslaved people weren't just property, they were lab rats. The truth was far more disturbing and twisted than a simple act of hatred. Thomas looked at Elias, at his haunted eyes and his trembling hands. He lowered his own hands, his mind racing. He had been so consumed with the idea of a simple, horrific crime that he had missed the underlying madness. The hum of the generator, the strange metallic scent, the meticulous ledgers, it all fit perfectly into this new, terrifying narrative. Elias and Margaret weren't the villains of this story, they were its tragic victims. He kept the key because he was afraid, Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. He was afraid of what would happen if the experiment failed. He believed the miasma would poison the world. He wanted to be the only one to survive. He was a monster, but he was a coward. "He forced you to live with this?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with a profound sorrow. Elias nodded, tears streaming down his face. "He made us swear on our lives. He said if we ever told anyone, he would kill us. He said he would kill us and then kill himself. He was a tyrant, a monster." He gestured with the shotgun at the house. "We've been living here in this tomb. We've been living with the ghosts of what he did. Every night we hear the hum. Every morning we remember the screams. We're not living. We're just existing, waiting for the silence to stop." A sudden, sharp cry came from the drawing room. Margaret had collapsed. Thomas rushed to her side, his journalistic instincts taking over. She was breathing, but her face was pale and her body was shaking uncontrollably. She was having a seizure. Elias ran to her, dropping the shotgun on the floor with a loud clatter. Margaret, no, not now!" Elias cried, his voice filled with a desperate, frantic fear. He held her close, his face a mask of pure terror. Thomas knew what he had to do. He had to help them. He had to get them out of this house. He had to expose the truth, not just for the sake of justice, but for their sake, to free them from the prison of their past. He picked up the shotgun and broke it open, emptying the shells onto the floor. He threw the gun to the side. "We have to get her to a doctor," Thomas said, his voice firm and steady. "She needs help. We all do." Elias looked at him, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope. You can help us." "Yes," Thomas said, a newfound purpose in his voice. "I can. We can expose this. We can bring this to an end." He helped Elias carry Margaret to her room. They laid her on the bed, her body still convulsing. Elias held her hand, his face a mask of profound sorrow. "She's been getting worse," he whispered. "The guilt, it's eating her alive. It's eating us alive." Thomas stood by the door, watching them. He saw the full, unvarnished truth of their lives, a life of silent suffering, of guilt and regret. He saw not a perpetrator but a victim, a man who had been a prisoner for over 20 years. He was not just here to report a story, he was here to save a life. He knew he couldn't leave them. He had to stay. He had to help them. He had to be the one to let the silence finally scream. He went to his room and grabbed his bag. He took out the ledgers and the lockbox, and he placed them on the bed. He had the proof. He had the motive. He had the full story. He just needed to find a way to get out and tell it. He sat down on the edge of the bed, the ledgers and the lockbox on the floor. He had come here to report on the past, but he had found himself embroiled in the present. He had come here to document a history, but he had found himself in the middle of a living, breathing tragedy. He had come here to find a story, but he had found a mission. He had to expose this. He had to save them. He had to be the one to let the silence finally scream. He looked at the ledgers and the lockbox, and he realized he was the one who was now a prisoner of their past. He was the only one who could set them free. The sun rose, painting the sky in a bruised palette of orange and purple. Thomas had spent the night by Elias and Margaret's side, a silent vigil in a house that felt more like a mausoleum. Margaret's seizures had subsided, leaving her in a deep, exhausted sleep. Elias, however, was wide awake, his eyes fixated on some point in the distance. A silent, broken man. He spoke of his father's obsession with the miasma, the bizarre contraptions he built, and the terror of living under his tyrannical rule. He spoke of the day the Union soldiers arrived, and his father, in a final act of madness, sealed the room. He spoke of the guilt he felt, the guilt of a son who had witnessed a crime and was too weak to stop it. Thomas listened, his heart heavy. He knew this was the story he had to tell. It was not just a story of a horrific crime, but a story of human madness, of a twisted legacy, and of the profound suffering of those who were left behind. He had to get this story out. He had to get the ledgers and the lockbox to the outside world. He had to be the one to let the silence finally scream. He decided on a plan. He would approach the town. He would seek help from the local sheriff, from the people who had lived with the whispers and rumors for so long. He would present them with the evidence, the ledgers, the lockbox, and the horrifying truth of what was hidden in the Blackwood house. He had to get their help to open the room and give the victims a proper burial. He told Elias his plan. Elias, for the first time in a long time, showed a spark of life, a flicker of hope. "They won't believe you," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "They'll think you're mad. They'll think we're mad." "I have proof," Thomas said, holding up his bag with the ledgers and the lockbox inside. "I have the ledgers. I have your father's words. I have the proof of his madness." Elias shook his head. "My father. He was a powerful man. He had connections. The town. They were afraid of him. They'll be afraid of you." Thomas didn't care. He had to try. He had to expose this. He had to get them out. He had to let the silence finally scream. He went to the front door, the same door he had tried to open the night before. This time it was unlocked. Elias had unlocked it. He was giving him a choice. He was giving him a chance to get out. Thomas stepped outside, the morning sun warm on his face. He took a deep breath of the humid Alabama air, a stark contrast to the stale, oppressive air of the house. He walked down the long, overgrown driveway, leaving the house behind him. He didn't look back. He had a mission. He had a story. He had a responsibility. He arrived in Montgomery, the town a bustling hive of activity. He went to the sheriff's office, a small, wooden building on the main street. The sheriff, a large, burly man with a kind face, listened to his story, his expression slowly shifting from skepticism to a deep, profound shock. Thomas laid out the ledgers, the lockbox, the letter from Elias to his father. He told him about the sealed room, the humming generator, the chilling reality of what had happened. He told him about the victims, the names in the ledger, the families who had been left to die. The sheriff, his face pale, read the ledgers. He saw the names, the dates, the cold clinical notes. He saw the proof. He saw the madness. He knew the rumors about the Blackwoods were true. He called for his deputies, and together they rode out to the plantation. They were armed, but they didn't expect a fight. They expected a crime scene, a tomb. They arrived at the Blackwood estate. The house was silent. The humming of the generator was no longer audible from the outside. A cold dread washed over Thomas. They rushed to the front door, the sheriff's hand on his gun. The door was unlocked. They entered the house. The drawing room was empty. The sound of a single rhythmic tapping came from the back of the house. Thomas's blood ran cold. The metronome. It was still running. They followed the sound to the back corridor, to the sealed room. The wooden plank was splintered. The chains were on the floor. The lock was broken. The door was open. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. The metronome was gone. The ledgers were gone. The lockbox was gone. The iron cylinders were gone. The generator was gone. The room was clean, as if no one had ever been there. The sheriff looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with a profound confusion. "What is this?" he asked. "What happened here?" Thomas stood in the middle of the empty room, a cold, empty feeling in his gut. He had been so sure, he had been so certain. He had the proof, he had the ledgers, he had the letter. But it was all gone. He had nothing. He had no proof. He had no story. He had no way to let the silence scream. He realized the horrible truth. This wasn't just a story about a crime. It was a story about a family who was willing to do anything to keep their secret. Elias and Margaret hadn't given him the proof. They had set him up. They had let him see the truth, and then they had taken it all away. They had used him. They had sent him away with a false hope, a false promise. They had made him believe he was their savior, their liberator. But he was just a tool, a pawn in their game. A man who would be discredited and forgotten, a man who would be seen as a madman, a man who would be a prisoner of their past. And the silent screaming of the house, it was still there. It was still trapped within the walls. It was still in the hum of the machine that was now gone. But the silence that was louder than a scream. It was the silence of a truth that could never be told. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. The silence in the now empty room was deafening. It was a silence that spoke of a calculated deception, a sinister game that Thomas had naively walked into. The Blackwoods had used his own journalistic curiosity against him, feeding him a truth so shocking he would believe it implicitly, a truth they knew he could never prove. The ledgers, the lockbox, the letter, they were all a carefully constructed theater, a performance designed to make him their unwitting messenger. The sheriff and his deputies scoured the room, their faces a mix of confusion and suspicion. They found nothing. No trace of the generator, no rusted cylinders, no evidence of a crime. The room was just an ordinary cellar, filled with old dust and the smell of decay. The splintered plank and the broken chains were the only proof that something had been here, but they were easily explained away. An old repair, a broken lock, nothing to suggest the monstrous tale Thomas had spun. "Mr. "Thomas," the sheriff said, his voice now cold and formal. "I don't know what kind of story you're trying to sell, but there's nothing here. This room is empty." Thomas's mind raced, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had to explain. He had to make them understand. "They moved everything," he said, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "Elias and Margaret. They moved it all last night. They were setting me up." The sheriff looked at him, his gaze now one of pity and disbelief. "Son, that house is a ruin. They're old. They couldn't have moved all that equipment on their own. And where would they have taken it? They couldn't have just made it disappear." The truth was a bitter pill to swallow. They were right. An old, frail couple couldn't have moved a massive generator and multiple iron cylinders in the dead of night. This wasn't a last-minute deception. It was a long-planned, meticulously executed lie. The hum Thomas had heard, the tapping, it was all a part of the performance. The room wasn't sealed to keep a secret in. It was sealed to make the story more believable. The Blackwoods had been living in this house of mirrors for years, perfecting their performance, waiting for the right person to come along. Thomas was that person. He was their mark. He felt a cold, empty feeling in his gut. He had come here with a mission, a sense of righteous purpose. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he was uncovering a great evil. But he had been played. He was not a hero. He was a fool. He left the plantation, the sheriff and his deputies behind him, their gazes filled with a mixture of suspicion and scorn. He walked back to town, the humid air now feeling like a personal affront, the sun a mocking presence in the sky. He had nothing. He had no story. He had no proof. He had nothing but his own discredited testimony. He went to the local inn, the one he had been staying at. He packed his bags, his hands shaking. He had to get out of this town. He had to get back to New York. He had to try and piece together what had happened, to understand the depths of their deception. But as he was about to leave, he heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic hum. He froze, his hand on the door handle. The sound was coming from the back of the inn. He followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He came to the back of the building, to a small wooden shed. The hum was louder here, a constant low thrumming. He peered through a crack in the wooden door. Inside, he saw the generator. It was the same one from the blueprints, the same one he had seen in the sealed room. It was humming, a low, constant thrum. He saw a man tending to it, a large, burly man with a kind face. It was the sheriff. Thomas's blood ran cold. The sheriff wasn't a kind, trusting man. He was an accomplice. He was a part of the deception. The entire town was a part of it. The rumors, the whispers, it was all a part of the Blackwoods story. A carefully woven tapestry of lies designed to lure him in, to make him believe the unbelievable, and then to discredit him when he tried to tell the world. He saw the sheriff turn, and their eyes met. The sheriff's face, which had been so kind and trusting just moments ago, was now a mask of cold, malevolent hatred. He held a large wrench in his hand, a heavy iron tool that was now a weapon. "You should have stayed out of this, Mr. Thomas," the sheriff said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Some secrets are best left buried. Some silences. They're meant to scream forever." Thomas turned and ran. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, the sound of the sheriff's footsteps and the rhythmic hum of the generator, a chilling song of his own impending doom. He had stumbled into a hornet's nest. He had found a conspiracy far more sinister than a single family's crime. He had found a town built on a lie, a community of accomplices, a place where the silent screams were a shared secret. He was not just a fool. He was a target, and the silent screams of the dead were about to be joined by the screaming of the living. Thomas's flight was a desperate, panicked race for survival. The humid air, once a symbol of the South's languid pace, now felt like a suffocating blanket, a conspiratorial force working against him. The streets of Montgomery, once a portrait of tranquil Americana, were now a labyrinth of hostile faces, every person he passed a potential accomplice. He could feel their eyes on him, their gazes a silent judgment, a shared secret that he had stumbled upon. He ran to the train station, the only way out of this living nightmare. The train was due in an hour, an agonizing eternity. He had to hide. He ducked into a small alleyway, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The sound of the sheriff's heavy boots echoed in the distance, a relentless, unyielding rhythm of a man on the hunt. He had to think. What was the motive? Why this elaborate deception? It wasn't just about hiding a family's monstrous past. It was about something else. The Blackwoods, the sheriff, the entire town. They were all connected. But how? He remembered the letter, the one from Elias to his father, the theory of the miasma, the Black Wood, the madman's legacy. It was all a part of a larger plan, a plan that was still in motion. He remembered Clara, the old woman who had told him about the sealed room. Her words had been a part of the performance, a carefully crafted piece of the story. But she had also told him about the whispering walls, the screams of the dead. Was she a part of it too? Was she a willing accomplice or a prisoner of her own past? He didn't know. He couldn't trust anyone. He saw a familiar face from the corner of his eye. It was Margaret. She was standing on a porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face pale and her eyes filled with a profound sadness. But this time, Thomas saw no sorrow. He saw a cold, calculated malevolence. Her eyes met his, and a small, bitter smile played on her lips. She raised a hand and pointed, a silent, damning accusation. The sheriff was coming. Thomas ran. He ran through a maze of backyards and alleyways, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. He had to get to the station. He had to get on that train. He had to get away from this town of silent screams. But as he emerged from the last alley, he saw it. The train station was surrounded. Men stood with shotguns, their faces grim and unyielding. The entire town had been mobilized. They were not just protecting a secret. They were protecting their way of life. He turned to run, but a voice stopped him. "There's nowhere to go, son." It was Elias. He was standing in front of him, a small, unassuming man who was a part of a monstrous conspiracy. He held a small black book in his hands. It was the ledgers, the ones Thomas had seen in the sealed room. The Black Wood. It was never about the air, Elias said, his voice a low, hollow echo. It was about the land, the soil. My father. He believed the land was cursed, that it was the source of all evil. He believed the only way to purify it was to feed it, to give it a sacrifice. Thomas's blood ran cold. The ledgers weren't a record of murder. They were a record of a ritual, a grotesque, horrifying ritual. The people in the room weren't just victims, they were a sacrifice to appease a madman's god. The miasma was not a poison in the air. It was a poison in the soil. A poison that had to be purged with blood. Elias opened the ledger. He pointed to a single, final entry. It was dated the night Thomas arrived. The handwriting was neat, precise. The journalist, the sacrifice, the new beginning. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drum of pure terror. He wasn't just a mark. He wasn't just a fool. He was the final piece of the puzzle. He was the last sacrifice. He was the one who was meant to let the silence scream forever. Elias looked at him, his eyes filled with a strange, manic light. My father, he taught us his ways. He taught us the truth. The town, they all believe. They all know. The silent screams. They're a part of the ritual. The more they scream, the more the land is purified. He looked at Thomas, a small, triumphant smile on his lips. You thought you were a hero. You thought you were here to save us. But you were just a tool, a pawn. a part of the plan, a part of the sacrifice. Thomas was surrounded. There was no escape. The town of silent screams, a community of fanatics, was closing in. He was about to become the final entry in a ledger of death. He was about to become the last sacrifice in a grotesque, horrifying ritual. And the screams he was about to make would not be a part of the story he wrote. They would be a part of a story that would never be told. A story that would be forever buried in the Alabama soil. The night air was a cold, oppressive presence. Thomas was bound and gagged, his body a prisoner in the back of a horse-drawn cart. The cart was rumbling down a dusty, unpaved road, its rhythmic jolts a constant reminder of his impending doom. The town of Montgomery was a silent, malevolent presence behind them, its lights a mocking testament to the normalcy he had once believed in. He was a sacrifice, a pawn in a grotesque, horrifying ritual. He had been taken to the Blackwood estate. The house was a dark specter against the night sky, its windows like black, hollow eyes. The sheriff was at the reins, his face grim and unyielding. Elias and Margaret were in the back of the cart, their faces a mixture of solemn duty and a manic, feverish excitement. They were not just accomplices, they were believers. They were fanatics. They arrived at the sealed room. The door was open, the chains and the plank gone. The room was not empty. The generator was there, the iron cylinders were there, and the air was thick with the same metallic, earthy scent that had filled the house. But there was something else. A large iron table in the center of the room. It was a sacrificial altar. Thomas was laid on the table, his body a helpless offering. He could see the fanaticism in Elias's eyes, the cold, malevolent gaze of the sheriff, the strange, almost serene smile on Margaret's face. They were not just a family of monsters. They were a cult that believed in a perverted, twisted form of purification. A cult that believed in the power of blood and sacrifice to appease a madman's god. Elias held up a large, ornate key. "The key to the purification," he said, his voice a low, fanatical whisper. "My father, he was not a murderer. He was a liberator. He freed us from the miasma. He freed us from the world's poison. And we will continue his work. We will make this land pure again." He gestured to the iron cylinders. "The poison, it's not gas. It's a fertilizer, it's a nutrient, a special arcane mixture, a mixture of blood and iron, the sacrifice, and it's not for the land. It's for the plants, for the new life, for the black wood." Thomas's mind reeled. It was all a lie. The theory of the miasma, the sealed room, the sacrifice. It was all a grotesque, horrifying ritual, a ritual to grow a new kind of plant, a new kind of wood. A black wood, a black heart. He saw the truth in Elias's eyes, a truth far more terrifying than a simple murder, a truth far more twisted than a simple conspiracy. It was a truth of a town, a community, a cult that had been growing a grotesque, horrifying new life, a new life that fed on the blood of the innocent. Elias walked to the generator, he turned a valve, and a low, persistent hum filled the room. The iron cylinders began to hiss, a soft, sickening sound. The air became thick with a strange, sweet and metallic scent. The scent of blood, the scent of iron, the scent of a new life being born. Thomas's vision began to blur. His lungs began to burn. The poison was not gas. It was a liquid, a thick, viscous liquid that was being pumped into the room. He could feel it in the air, a thick, suffocating presence. He tried to scream, but the gag was too tight. The screams were silent. A silent scream in a town of silent screams. He looked at Elias, at Margaret, at the sheriff. He saw a cold, detached sense of satisfaction on their faces. They were not monsters. They were believers. They were zealots. They were a part of a legacy that was not about a crime, but about a creed. a creed that was born in the madness of a single man and had now infected an entire community. His last thought was of the silence of the dead, the silence of a town, the silence of a world that would never know the truth, the silent screams of the innocent, the silent screams of his own, the silence that was louder than any scream, and the screams that were now a part of the silence. The last thing he saw was the eerie rhythmic tapping of the metronome on a small wooden table. It was a timer for a life, a timer for a ritual, a timer for a new life being born. The silent screams were a part of a new kind of sound, a sound that was a part of a new kind of life, a new kind of wood, the black wood, the black heart. The end of the story, the end of his life. The last silent scream was his own, and then there was only the sound of the hum and the sound of the silence.